To return to the centuries before the Norman invasion requires careful research. Much of the evidence is hidden away, but as we shall see when uncovered, it can be both startling and inspiring. To begin this part of our journey, we shall head onto the high limestone plateau to find one of the Dark Age's most illuminating artefacts. This is the Church of St. Peter in Alstonfield, and preserved within its walls is an extremely rare exhibitionist carving, the first of its kind to be found in Staffordshire. It was found only a few years ago amongst this pile of cross fragments and other carvings dating back well into the Anglo-Saxon period of the church. Now, these exhibitionist carvings, some believe, are like the other grotesques found in churches, dating back to the 11th and 12th centuries and being almost comical figures designed to warn people of the evils and demons around them. But what makes the Shielnagigs interesting in many of their settings is that they do not match the surrounding masonry, perhaps saying that they could date back to the earlier Christian churches that would have lain under many of the sites. These carvings are called Shielnagigs, and they have or show a woman exposing her vulva. Now, many people believe that could be a hark back to the ancient pagan goddess, even the goddess of fertility. But this carving, unlike most Shielnagigs, has another unusual side to it. Here you can see on top is a beast that is devouring the woman below it. The beast itself is opening up the woman's vulva, perhaps saying that this one is not only a warning about the pleasures of the flesh, but also the demons that could consume you. Although Shielnagigs can be found in other parts of the country, each is unique, and the questions they raise about the psychology of Anglo-Saxon minds will remain hotly debated for years to come. Other Anglo-Saxon remains can be seen within the Church of St. Peter. There is an unusual 8-sided font, parts of several tombs, and many fragments of cross shafts. All of these were probably made shortly after the visit of St. Oswald, Bishop of York, who dedicated the church in 892 AD. In the churchyard, the base of a carved Anglo-Saxon cross still survives in situ. Crosses were primarily structures of religious observance, and so were built at most churches. They were also placed at points along important routeways and in marketplaces, showing that the church sanctioned the trade which went on there. The parish church of Wirksworth contains even more Anglo-Saxon fragments. Embedded within the walls of St. Mary's are fantastical carvings of both people and creatures. This is Told Man, an ancient lead miner with his pick and kibble. He is reputed to be the oldest representation of a miner in the world. Of all the Anglo-Saxon carvings that remain in the Peak District, one stands out as being more intricate and more beautiful than any other. Known as the Wirksworth Stone, it now resides on a wall in St. Mary's Church in Wirksworth amongst a plethora of other Anglo-Saxon carvings. It was discovered some 2 metres below the high altar and covered a tomb in which was a perfectly preserved skeleton. It's believed to be the tomb of Betty, one of the 4 priests who came down from Lindisfarne in the 7th century to found the monastery at Repton. The stone itself is beautifully carved with 8 different biblical scenes, some sadly partially lost from either side over time, but each portraying a fascinating insight into Anglo-Saxon Christian religious belief. The 8 fragments contained within the stone are of great interest to religious scholars. The first shows Christ washing the feet of the disciples, a scene which was favoured in the Gallican liturgy. The second represents the crucifixion. In the centre of the Grecian cross is a slain lamb, around which evangelists hold books. This symbol was banned by the Church in 692 AD, because the implications of a dead lamb were not seen as a suitable representation of Christ everlasting. The third shows the burial of the Virgin as described in the apocryphal New Testament. A high priest who tried to interfere with the burial is being dragged away underneath. This is the earliest portrayal of the scene in Western art. The final image of the top row shows the presentation in the temple. Christ is held in the arms of Simeon, with the Blessed Virgin to the right and the hand of God pointing down from above. The bottom row starts with a terrifying image of the descent into hell. The worst sinners, Cain, Herod and Judas, are to be seen burning in a brazier. Above, Christ releases all other souls in the form of a swaddled baby. The ascension of Christ to heaven follows. He holds a staff and is conveyed by 4 archangels, with the Blessed Virgin and St. John watching on with 2 angels below. The third scene illustrates the Annunciation, with the seated Blessed Virgin approached by the Angel of Annunciation carrying a scroll. The final image is of the Blessed Virgin holding the infant Christ. He bears a scroll with one hand and points to St. Peter with the other, indicating that the disciples should spread the word through him. Apart from these stone carvings, few structures survive in the Peak District from the Dark Ages. This phrase was coined in the Renaissance and is a reference to the intellectual darkness which existed through the epoch. Much of what we do know comes from just a few religious accounts, such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. The Dark Ages began in the mid-5th century, when Britain was politically and administratively fragmented. There was no major industrial production, most international trade had ceased, and the monetary system had collapsed. In 547 AD, a horrifying event called the Great Mortality was visited upon Britain. A few references in books such as the Annals of Wales are all we have on this great plague. Numbers are not specified, though are inferred to be large, and as symptoms are not described, we are unsure as to exactly what it was. After the Great Mortality, the Germanic pagans from the continent began their invasion and colonisation of parts of England. These Saxons arrived in well-designed ships and were adept fighters, having little trouble subduing the local populations. The beautiful Bentley Grange helmet dates from around AD 650 and was the first Anglo-Saxon warrior's helmet discovered in Britain. The surviving iron bands would have supported plates of horn, and the nasal of the helmet is decorated with a silver cross. On the helmet's crest is an iron boar with bronze eyes, inset with garnet. Helmets with boar crests are described in the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf. At this time England was still pagan, but Christianity had begun its spread from the southeast. As mentioned earlier, Pope Gregory sent Augustine to Kent in AD 597, and from then on the slow conversion of the English kingdoms to Christianity began. After the Germanic pagans had finished their major series of invasions, it was the turn of the Vikings. They first arrived from over the North Sea in AD 789. Over the following years, the Vikings were to kill tens of thousands of people across our islands. One of the bloodiest attacks was the massacre of the monks of Holy Island in AD 793. Those that were not struck by broadsword were drowned as the tide came in. Although many early attacks were from raiding parties, the Vikings eventually began to settle, and a large part of England became subject to Danish control. The Vikings were a brutal people who showed no mercy and spread fear wherever they travelled. Great sagas survive to tell us about their gods and moral code, but there are surprisingly few records of Viking life. One of the most informative was written by a 10th century Arab Muslim writer named Ahmad ibn Fadal. Whilst on the eastern trade route, he encountered a Scandinavian Viking chieftain and accompanied his group for many days. The account is a unique source containing the only thorough account we have of a Viking chieftain's funeral.
They are the filthiest race that God ever created. They do not wipe themselves after a stool, nor wash themselves thereafter, any more than if they were wild asses. Every morning a girl comes and brings a tub of water and places it before her master. In this he proceeds to wash his face and hands, and then his hair, combing it out over the vessel. Thereupon he blows his nose and spits into the tub, and leaving no dirt behind, conveys it all into this water. When he has finished, the girl carries the tub to the man next to him, who does the same. Thus she continues carrying the tub from one to another until each man has blown his nose and spit into the tub and washed his face and hair. A Viking funeral was told that when their chiefs die, they consume them with fire. When I heard that one of their leaders had died, I wanted to see this myself. First they laid him in his grave, over which a roof was erected, for the space of 10 days, until they had completed cutting and sewing his funeral clothes. At the death of a rich man, they bring together his goods and divide them into 3 parts. The first of these is for his family, the second is expended for the garments they make, and with the third they purchase strong drink, for the day when the girl resigns herself to death and will be burned with her master. When one of their chiefs dies, his family asks his girl and pages, which one of you will die with him? One will answer, I. When the day had come that the dead man and the girl were committed to the flames, I went to the river where his ship lay, but found it had already been drawn ashore. The dead man lay at a distance in his grave, from which they had not yet removed him. Next they brought a couch, placed it in the ship, and covered it with a Greek cloth of gold, wadded and quilted with pillows of the same material. A woman, who they called the Angel of Death, came and spread articles on the couch. It was she who was to slay the girl. They drew the dead man out of the grave and clothed him. They carried him into the ship, seated him on the quilted covering, supported him with the pillows, and brought strong drinks, fruits, and herbs that placed beside him. Finally they brought a cock and then slew him and threw them in two. The girl meanwhile walked to and fro, entering one after another of the tents which they had there. The occupant of each tent lay with her, saying, Tell your master I did this only for love of you. It was now Friday afternoon, and they led the girl to an object they had constructed which looked like a door frame. They lifted her and lowered her several times. Then they handed her a hen whose head they had cut off. They gave her strong drink and admonished her to drink it quickly. After this the girl seemed dazed. At this moment the men began to beat upon their shields in order to drown out the noise of her cries, which might deter other girls from seeking death for their masters in the future. They laid her down and seized her hands and feet. The old woman, known as the Angel of Death, knotted a rope around her neck and handed the ends to two men to pull. Then, with a broad dagger, she stabbed her between the ribs while the men strangled her. Thus she died. The family of the dead men drew near, and taking a piece of wood, lit the ship. The ship was soon aflame, as was the couch, the man, the girl, and everything in it. At my side, one of the Northmen was talking with my interpreter. After their conversation, I asked my interpreter what he had said. The Northman had said, You Arabs are stupid. You would take him who is the most revered and beloved among men and cast him into the ground, to be devoured by creeping things and worms. We, on the other hand, burn him in a twinkling, so that he instantly, without a moment's delay, enters into paradise.
Records of Danish activity in the Peak District are scant to none, but just south of Derby is the village of Repton, where we find evidence of not only the Vikings but the ruling elite of Anglo-Saxon England. Repton was the centre of the Kingdom of Mercia, where the ruling family decided to construct a monastery in the late 7th century. In AD 865, a great Viking army landed on the east coast of England. This time they were not merely disparate raiding groups, they had joined together, an allegiance of Vikings from Norway, Denmark and Sweden, and conquest was their aim. They wanted to see the downfall of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of England. Pretty soon after landing, York fell, followed by Nottingham and then East Anglia. Soon only one kingdom lay in their path, the Kingdom of Wessex. In AD 873-4, they overwintered at a place called Repton. Then it was the capital of the Kingdom of Mercia. In fact, it is from where we are standing here, outside St. Wiston's Church, that the Viking soldiers built their D-shaped enclosure linking to the River Trent, from which they protected themselves over the long, harsh winter. But harsh it was indeed, for excavations only a few decades ago discovered a mass burial of 249 Viking soldiers. Not murdered, but instead they had fallen to disease during the harsh British winter. St. Wiston's Church is very ancient. Standing on the site of the original Anglo-Saxon monastery, we have this beautiful structure, mainly constructed in the 12th and 13th centuries, but with a great amount of restoration conducted during the 18th. However, the real treasure and interest for us does not lie on the surface here, but lies underground. Follow me into the dark. And mind your head, it's quite narrow. You have descended into a magical place. Nowhere else in the Peak District can you get closer to our Anglo-Saxon ancestors. History is in the walls and the very air that we breathe down here. This is the resting place of King Ethelbald of Mercia. Murdered in AD 757, only a few miles south of here, his body was buried outside what was then St. Wiston's Monastery. When it had decayed until only the bones were left, they were brought inside and placed in one of the dark alcoves behind me.
This ain't it, this ain't it, every neat and all, fire and fleet and candle lit, and Christ receive thy soul. When thou from hence away art past, every neat and all, to Winnie-Muir thou comest at last, and Christ receive thy soul. If ever thou gavest hosen and shoon, every neat and all, sit thee down and put them on, and Christ receive thy soul.
The crypt would not have looked like this in the time of King Ethelbald. Instead, it was his grandson, King Wiglaf, who in 839 changed the appearance of the crypt enormously. He built the 4 beautiful columns with their rope work, and also the high vaulted ceiling above our heads. The crypt changed in 849 from just being a family burial place to becoming a place of pilgrimage. For in this year, King Wistan was murdered and martyred, and from then on, people wanted to visit the place where his bones and his relics were kept.
If meat or drink thou negate name, every neat and all, the fire will burn thee to thy bed bane, and Christ receive thy soul. This ain't it, this ain't it, every neat and all, fire and fleet and candle lit, and Christ receive thy soul.
The great Danish army that overwintered here did not succeed in conquering the whole of southern England. They smashed many of the individual Saxon kingdoms, but when it came to Wessex, they had to contend with Alfred the Great, who was such a great leader that they never bested him. Wessex continued to be a strong kingdom even after Alfred's death. By the late 9th century, 3 other kingdoms had managed to reconsolidate, giving a picture of England like this. But boundaries were fluid and subject to a fragile balance. Alfred had the grand concept of unifying all the kingdoms under one king, but this task would not be finally completed until the arrival of William the Conqueror in 1066. Whilst England was in a constant state of upheaval, a very, very important change took place. From the 9th to the 11th centuries, the first step in what became our modern villages and towns began. This constructive process was known as settlement nucleation. Around the newly constructed village churches, a series of cottages would be built and other buildings for community, trade and agricultural use. Sadly, most of this process is shrouded in the mists of time, but there are still tantalising fragments remaining in some villages around the Peak District. Around the village of Chelmorton, it's still possible to see the remains of ancient medieval fields. In fact, it's thought that these could date back to even Anglo-Saxon times. They're fossilised in the modern dry stone walls that were put in at a much later date. You can see behind me that they're strip fields that head from the top of the hillside down to the bottom of the valley. This was on purpose so that no family who owned the field would have better land than others. They'd each have the dry part of the pasture at the top and the richer damp grassland in the valley bottom below. A result of this was that with each generation, fields ended up getting narrower and narrower. This was known as the open field farming system, and it remained in many areas for almost 1,000 years until the Enclosure Acts. In most other parts of the country, this ancient field pattern was then destroyed as it made moving unwieldy equipment very difficult, but at Chelmorton it still survives to this day. Higher up on the limestone plateau, just above Chelmorton, the field patterns spanning over millennia intermingle across the vast undulating plain of the Central Peak District.